Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. In today's episode, we're going to be looking at both the ongoing conflict between NATO, the Russian Federation, and we're also going to then jump over and continue to look at what is happening between India and Pakistan. Now, first, in relation to NATO and the Russian Federation, I was looking at some content today and yesterday, and there continues to be this perceived threat, either real, imagined, or just an attempt of trying to propagate a threat that the Russian Federation is in the preparatory phases of a military operation against Poland. Now, the rationale is additional Russian forces that have been moved into Belarus and Russian forces that are operating east of Finland, Murmansk, areas where Russian naval aviation has traditionally operated. And what we're seeing in these areas, again, is, for the most part, is Russian air defense assets. Now, you could say, okay, well, the Russians are moving in S-400s, S-300s. They're moving Air Force capability into Belarus. What is the purpose? Is it designed to shield a ground invasion of Poland? And the answer to that, the most reasonable and rational explanation, is going to be no. Well, the answer is going to be no. The Russians are not preparing for a military invasion of Poland. The force construct that you would see in terms of the movement of military manpower that would need to be used by the Russians to attack Poland is far beyond current Russian capability. Meaning that because of the war in Ukraine is utilizing a significant portion of Russian combat power. In all probability, upwards to 70% of Russian combat power is committed to the Ukrainian war. Now, if that war ended today, and if we were to see those forces then being moved into Western Belarus, and you're looking at a force construct in the neighborhood of 400,000 troops that would be moved from the Ukrainian area of operations to Western and Central Belarus. NATO would see that. And then you could say, okay, well, something is happening here. But we're not seeing that. We're not even seeing the infrastructure present in Western Belarus to support that kind of military operation. Again, what we do see are these air defense assets. So why are these Russian air defense assets there? Well, let's look at another map. These are NATO enhanced battle groups. These areas in this light blue. You can see they're present in Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. Quote unquote NATO's eastern flank. This is a diagram, a map of NATO deployment strategy in regards to air capability with the border of the Russian Federation. And you can see there is a significant monitoring force that is being used by NATO and includes the United States, United Kingdom, France, Italy, Denmark, Czech Republic, Belgium, Poland, Germany, Spain, Slovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, and Turkey. And you can see where these air operations are ongoing. Again, right up against the borders of the Russian Federation. You know, what's interesting, I look at this map, and we harken back to the very early 90s, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the discussions about the possibility that Poland could be in a position to join NATO. And there was a great deal of debate that why would there be NATO forces in Poland? There was even talk about, with the unification of Germany, why would there be a NATO presence in Eastern Germany? Because again, the perception was that NATO was designed to defend Western Europe. Well, this is a little bit different, right? I think any reasonable person would look at this and say that the quote-unquote mandate or the objectives of NATO have pushed well beyond defending Western and Central and parts of Central Europe to this deployment strategy now. And then what is that deployment strategy? Well, obviously it's the containment, quote-unquote containment, of the Russian Federation. It provides capacity and capability in case something were to happen. But again, NATO moved into this position prior to the Russians moving into a similar position. The force constructs that NATO has created in Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, did not exist in these border states such as Belarus. There is not the same kind of military capability, and nor was there the same type of military capability that now exists in Poland, Lithuania, Slovakia, Hungary. That capability, in terms of NATO moving those forces, predated any sort of Russian movement into Belarus, into Western Belarus. Yeah, there were yearly military operations that took place, but a omnipresent amount of forces in Belarus was not present. The Russians didn't have that kind of force structure there. And again, even to this day, as you see these enhanced battle groups that are operating in the Baltic States, and again, we go back to the 1990s. You know, the thought of NATO forces entering Poland was very controversial. And the short answer, well, why? Why would NATO need to do that? In the whole concept of the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, was just really off the table. And now you have these NATO battle groups that are present in those nation states. Now, again, when Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania join an alliance that is 100% designed to fight Russia. Let's face it, the primary reason for NATO's existence is to fight Russia and or the former Soviet Union. So when you join an alliance, and the primary goal of that alliance is a military capacity that is designed to fight the Russians, well, you're probably going to get the attention of the Russians. If we look before, let's say, 2020, in terms of the Russian capability, the Russian ability to project power into the Baltics, there wasn't a lot there. Traditionally, the Russians have kept a airborne division in Pskov, and there's also a motorized rifle division just to the west of St. Petersburg. Not a motorized rifle division, I apologize. A motorized rifle brigade. So you had what is essentially an understrength rapid deployment division of airborne troops here, and then you had one brigade just to the west of St. Petersburg. Now could the Russians quickly flex forces from the Moscow military district, such as the 2nd and 4th armored divisions just to the west of Moscow? Yeah, absolutely. But at the same time, NATO is going to see that. They're going to see that deployment. And again, when you have these nation states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and given their position, given the geography, given the population and their military capability, it is really an untenable position. And I've talked about this before. NATO has put itself in a very difficult situation trying to defend the Baltic states. But they have also put themselves, meaning NATO, in a position. Again, if you look at these maps, you have Kaliningrad here. You have NATO military units here. NATO military units here. NATO has completely enveloped Kaliningrad. Completely. Now, I don't know, just being reasonable, is Russia more of a threat to the Suwalki Gap here, or is NATO more of a threat to Kaliningrad? Now, what would that look like? I don't know. It's difficult to say. I would imagine it's preparatory operations in case of something happening inside of Russia, meaning some sort of color revolution inside of Russia. Russia fractures. What would NATO do? Well, I think Russia has a understanding of what NATO would do and how it would operate, especially if the Russian Federation starts to fragment. Would these forces be used in Kaliningrad? And that's what the Russians are looking at. And then you also have to look at Finland. So in these other pieces of content I was looking at, we were looking at some Bear bombers operating near Murmansk. We have seen some S-400 sites that have always been in this area. This is a strategic area for Russia in terms of subsurface operations, submarine operations, nuclear missile subs, and nuclear submarines, nuclear attack submarines. And then Finland joins NATO. Well, yeah, you are going to see the Russians conducting military operations near Murmansk and along the Kola Peninsula. You're going to see that. And that's what we are seeing. We're not seeing any different buildup of forces in the Kola Peninsula near Murmansk than what would be normal through the late 90s, early 2000s. It's really kind of the same. Now, they've gone about the process of refurbishing bases, or not so much refurbishing bases, but upgrading bases. Building some new bases. They're converting some brigades into divisions in some of these areas. But again, we're not seeing, if you're looking at Finland, we're not seeing the kind of capability and capacity that would be present for a Russian invasion of Finland. So we've got the Russians possibly invading Finland. We got the Russians possibly invading the Baltics. We got the Russians possibly invading Poland, while the Russians are fighting this continued war in the Ukraine. Now, right now, there is zero chance that the Russians are preparing for war against Poland. Because look, if the Russians go to war against Poland, it is World War III. We will be in a state of world war. The United States, in all likelihood the United Kingdom, maybe the Germans, probably the French, different NATO nation states would come to the aid of the Poles. We would probably go to war over Poland. It's happened before. Now, The Baltics, not sure on that one. That was a strategic blunder by NATO to accept the Baltic states. Now, what's happening in India? What is happening with India and Pakistan? Well, about 48 hours ago, there was quite possibly one of the largest air-to-air engagements that has taken place between these nation states since probably the war in the 70s, 1971. These two powers engaged each other with beyond visual range missiles, and a number of aircraft were shot down. Now, it's very difficult to ascertain exactly what aircraft were shot down. Both nation states are being incredibly secretive about what was hit. We know for relative certainty that India lost at least one Rafale, possibly up to 3. We believe that in all likelihood, India may have lost between 5 and 6 aircraft. But again, we just don't know. It's very, very difficult because there is no journalists on the ground that are able to actively report in some of these areas. They are restricted, they're cordoned off, and you cannot get into these areas, and you're really relying on what the governments of India and Pakistan state. And they both have tendencies to make maximalist claims about what happened. Now, this is getting serious, very serious. It feels like we may be in a lull, but the last 48 hours have been very serious. There's been some reports that Indian weapon systems have hit Karachi. There's been reports Rawalpindi and Islamabad have been targeted. Some military assets were targeted by India. There has been the use of what we believe is the widespread use of Turkish TB2 Bayraktar drones used against Indian border positions along the line of contact. It is highly likely that India has sustained some very heavy casualties through the use of those drones. India has also launched Israeli-made long-range anti-radiation drones against targets inside of Pakistan as well. Now, for the most part, we understand that one air defense system, now we don't know if it was the actual missile system, the missile battery, or the air defense radar that was struck by these anti-radiation systems that India launched. In all probability, it would have been a radar system linked to a Chinese surface-to-air missile battery. But eventually, we hope to find out what exactly happened in this large air battle. Again, both forces were operating behind their shared border and were firing these very long-range, beyond visual range, air-to-air missiles at each other. And they were also using, at least we know Pakistan was using, long-range surface-to-air missile systems as well, as was India in terms of attempting to shoot down inbound Pakistani missiles. So we just don't have good information on casualties, on figures in terms of aircraft. It does appear on the surface, as we had talked about before, that given the capabilities of the Pakistani Air Force, given the capabilities of the Indian Air Force, during the initial operations, India took more damage meaning they lost more aircraft. Now, there's been some reports that Pakistan may have had an F-16 shot down, possibly two JF-17s, Chinese-made aircraft. We're still trying to ascertain if Pakistan utilized the J-10C against the Rafale. Obviously, China, France, the West is very much interested in terms of how the J-10C performed with its PL-15 missile against the Indian Rafale with its Meteor missile. So very interesting to see what plane performed better, what missile system was more accurate and had a higher percentage of hit rate. But again, given the secrecy that these two nation states operate in terms of release of information, that and part of it may be for the betterment of reducing further conflict. That's a very likely reason, because again, as casualties happen, the citizenry of these populations demand further conflict. And eventually, where do we end up? Well, they're two nuclear powers, and you can probably guess where that eventually takes us. But a very challenging situation right now, to say the least. A situation that could explode into a massive conflict. A conflict on par with what we are seeing right now between Russia and Ukraine, with more economic ramifications that could affect both nation states and the world, especially if you start talking about the use of tactical nuclear weapons. Always a possibility. I mean, once this gets off the leash and really gets out of hand, who knows where this will take us. But as we learn more, we will absolutely have more reports, and we're watching things very, very closely. As always, thank you for joining us. More to come very, very soon. Have a good day.